Mars is an endlessly fascinating place, which might seem a little strange and counterintuitive for a planet that, by all initial estimates, is cold, dry, and dead. Photos sent back from the many rovers that have landed on Mars have shown us an empty world of crumbling rock and dust, red with oxidized iron, and a thin, featureless sky, yellow with carbon dioxide. But at a chemical level, Mars is anything but bleak and dead. There are numerous ongoing processes that we don't fully understand, and which could even be evidence for Martian life. For example, we learned that during the onset of winter, much of the CO2 in the air condenses and freezes near the poles, which reduces the atmospheric pressure across the entire planet. During the spring and early summer, this frozen CO2 warms and boils back into a gaseous form, which in turn raises the atmospheric pressure across the planet. Other chemicals, like nitrogen and argon, also seem to cycle through the atmosphere in seasonal concentrations. For example, argon, which makes up a little less than 2% of Mars's atmosphere, appears to cycle relative to CO2. And nitrogen makes up about 2.6% of Mars's atmosphere, and it too cycles seasonally, being more common in the summer months. Now things start to get really weird when we talk about methane. Methane is a small organic compound, composed of a single carbon atom bound to 4 hydrogen atoms. While methane also follows a seasonal cycle, increasing in atmospheric concentration during the warmer summer months and decreasing during the colder winter months, it's not a chemical that's found only in the atmosphere, like argon, for example. In fact, the evidence collected so far seems to indicate that methane is released seasonally out of the ground. The observation of sudden spikes in methane concentration suggests that it comes out of cracks and fissures in the planet's surface, billowing up in the form of highly concentrated plumes. Once it's been released, the methane will diffuse through the atmosphere, where it gets broken down over time by UV radiation, creating free hydrogen and reactive carbon species that can bind together to form CO2. Now, we don't know exactly where this methane is coming from, although some suggestions include geochemical processes like serpentinization, which would accelerate during the warmer summer months and decelerate during the cooler winter months, which is, that's what we see, that's what the evidence shows. But it could also be caused by biological processes, like the metabolic activity of methanogenic Martian microbes. And if this is the case, then we would expect that this too would increase during the warmer summer months and decrease during the colder winter months. Nothing is confirmed yet, publicly at least. So for now, this is an ongoing methane mystery. But there's also a new chemical mystery that NASA is now talking about publicly, and it involves oxygen. Scientists expected oxygen to cycle seasonally pretty much just like all of these other chemicals, but it doesn't. Well, not exactly. It's much more irregular. Now, there's only a tiny amount of oxygen in Mars's atmosphere, but it appears that every spring and summer, its concentration in the atmosphere increases wildly and irregularly, sometimes by as much as 30%, but then in the fall and the winter, it reduces back down to levels that are predicted by known chemical processes. Because the summer increase in oxygen concentration varies from year to year, something must be producing the oxygen, and then consuming it in the fall. This phenomenon was described by Sushil Atreya, a University of Michigan climate and space scientist, as being, quote, just mind-boggling, unquote. Melissa Trainor is a planetary scientist at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, and she was the leader for this most recent research. Melissa Trainor said, quote, "We're struggling to explain this. The fact that the oxygen behavior isn't perfectly repeatable every season makes us think that it's not an issue that has to do with atmospheric dynamics. It has to be some chemical source and sink that we can't yet account for," unquote. Some of the proposed explanations include radiation breaking down oxygen molecules, oxygen molecules slipping away into space on the solar wind, water or CO2 breaking down in the atmosphere leading to localized oxygen concentrations, radiation breaking apart the peroxides and perchlorate in the soil, and even possible miscalibration or error on behalf of their measuring instruments. But none of these alternative explanations could explain the readings. None of them sufficiently explained the data. Their measuring instruments worked perfectly, and all of those other natural chemical processes would either take too long, or they don't operate at the scale necessary to explain the large and rapid increases that were observed in the spring oxygen concentration. For example, they estimate that it would take 1 million years for radiation breaking down perchlorates and peroxides in the soil to produce the amount of oxygen that's added to the atmosphere during a single Martian summer. Mr. Atreya said, quote, "We're beginning to see this tantalizing correlation between methane and oxygen for a good part of the Mars year. I think there's something to it. I just don't have the answers yet. Nobody does." Unquote. Timothy McConaughey is an assistant research scientist and co-author on the paper alongside Melissa Traynor, and Mr. McConaughey said, quote, "We have not been able to come up with one process yet that produces the amount of oxygen we need, but we think it has to be something in the surface soil that changes seasonally, because there aren't enough available oxygen atoms in the atmosphere to create the behavior that we see." Unquote. Ms. Traynor said, quote, "This is the first time where we're seeing this interesting behavior over multiple years. We don't totally understand it. For me, this is an open call to all of the smart people out there who are interested in this. See what you can come up with." Unquote. So there it is, another chemical mystery on Mars, and it's one that I'm excited to say points towards some kind of biological explanation. This is the Biologic Podcast, so I might be a little biased, but I do think that what we're seeing here is the effect of some kind of Martian biochemistry. I think we're seeing the seasonal metabolic respiration of some kind of alien microbe, or microbial community, that is somehow able to persist in the Martian soil. Perhaps this hunch will be confirmed when the Mars 2020 rover mission makes it to Mars, and digs into the soil of Jezero Crater. But until then, this curious oxygen activity is one more unsolved mystery, and another tantalizing secret of the Red Planet.